Jedediah Calloway had ridden out to the Bennett place, a half-day's ride from the little settlement of Antelope Springs in Wyoming Territory, that morning for one reason only: to buy a milk cow before the last leg of his cattle drive north to the railhead at Ogallala. He had no interest in anything else that little homestead had to offer. Not the sagging porch, not the fence that needed mending, not the quiet woman who came out to meet him with flowers still on her hands. He had cash in his pocket and a schedule to keep. That was all. He never got the chance to finish the deal in peace, because halfway through counting out silver dollars into Sarah Bennett's palm, a small girl in a patched cotton dress tugged twice on his sleeve, waited until he leaned down out of politeness more than curiosity, and whispered 5 words that stopped him colder than a Wyoming blue norther in January. "Today is my mom's last day." Jedediah straightened up slowly. He looked at the girl. Couldn't have been more than 7, with her mother's same steady brown eyes, and then he looked at Sarah Bennett, who had gone the color of old bone at whatever her daughter had just said. The coins sat forgotten in his hand. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "What does she mean by that?" Sarah's chin came up the way it does on people who have spent a long while refusing to cry in front of strangers. "Grace," she said to her daughter, not unkindly, "go on and check the hens." The girl went, throwing one last look back over her shoulder that Jedediah would remember for the rest of his life. Then Sarah turned to him and told him the truth, because there was no longer a version of that afternoon where she could avoid it. She was not dying. Nothing so final as that, though the way Grace had said it, and the way half the county would have assumed it too, was no accident of a child's imagination. It was simply the only way a 7-year-old had of describing the size of what was coming. Today was the day the banksman was riding out from Cheyenne to take the deed to the Bennett homestead, because the note her late husband had signed 2 winters back, before the fever took him in a single terrible week, was due in full, and there was no way on God's earth that Sarah Bennett could pay it. Selling the cow, her one good milk cow, the animal that had kept her and Grace fed through a hard winter, was the last thing she had left to sell, and it still wasn't going to be enough. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it is the moment that separates one kind of man from another. Jedediah Calloway could have finished the transaction, tipped his hat, and ridden on with a bargain milk cow and a story to tell at the next chuck wagon fire about the strange things a body hears on the trail. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He put the coins back in his own pocket, looked Sarah Bennett dead in the eye, and asked her the one question that mattered. "What time is the banksman due?" To understand why that question mattered so much, it helps to understand how land actually worked on the American frontier in the 1880s, because it was rarely as simple as staking a claim and calling it yours forever. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, a settler could claim up to 160 acres of public land, and after living on it and improving it for 5 years, the land became legally theirs, free and clear, no purchase price owed to the government. But the Homestead Act never promised an easy 5 years. Settlers still needed seed, tools, lumber, and livestock to survive those years, and precious few of them arrived with enough cash to cover it. That was where the local banks came in, and where things could turn dangerous fast. A settler like the late Mr. Bennett might take out what was called a chattel mortgage or a note secured against the homestead's improvements, the house, the barn, the fences, sometimes even the livestock itself, to bridge the gap until the farm could support itself. These notes came due on fixed dates, often with interest that compounded faster than a young farm could keep pace with. If a settler died, fell ill, or simply had one bad harvest at the wrong moment, the debt didn't care. It came due anyway, and a banker with a legal claim in hand had every right, under territorial law, to seize the property and sell it to satisfy the note. It happened to widows more than anyone, because a woman in most territories in that era had far fewer legal protections over property than a man did, and a banker riding out to collect knew that a grieving woman alone with a child had almost no leverage to argue otherwise. Jedediah knew all of this the way any man who'd worked cattle and land his whole life knew it. Not from a book, but from watching it happen to neighbors, to his own uncle once, back in Missouri. He knew the banksman would arrive with the note in hand, and unless the exact sum was paid before ink went to paper on a new deed, there would be nothing anyone could say or do about it. Sympathy did not count as legal tender. 2 o'clock, Sarah told him, and the sun outside was already climbing past 10. Jedediah did not have the full sum himself, not in his pocket, not without selling half his own trail herd at a fire sale price, which he could not do 4 days out from delivery without ruining the whole drive he'd promised his outfit. But he had something almost as valuable as cash on the frontier: neighbors and time, and a horse that could still cover 15 miles at a dead run if it had to. He rode first to the Peterson spread 2 miles east, where old Nils Peterson was mending a wagon wheel, and looked up in surprise at a strange cowboy pulling up in a lather. Jedediah didn't waste words. He told Peterson what was happening at the Bennett place, and Peterson, who had known Sarah's late husband, who had eaten at that family's table more than once, who understood exactly what a banksman riding out with a note in hand meant for a widow, didn't hesitate either. He dug into a coffee tin kept behind a loose board in his own barn and handed over what he could spare. This is the part of frontier life that rarely makes it into dime novels, but it is every bit as true as the gunfights and cattle stampedes that do. Homesteads scattered across the plains were desperately isolated. A neighbor might be 5, 10, 20 miles off, and that isolation was exactly why a tradition of mutual aid became not just a kindness but a survival strategy. Barn raisings, where an entire community would show up to build a family's barn in a single day. Harvest crews that moved from farm to farm so no one family faced a crop alone. Emergency loans between neighbors, given on nothing but a handshake and the shared understanding that next winter, the favor might run the other direction. The frontier is remembered as a place of rugged individualism, and there is truth in that, but it survived just as much on the quiet, unglamorous habit of neighbors refusing to let each other fall. From the Peterson place, Jedediah rode to the small trading post at Dry Fork Crossing, where he found the postmaster, a widowed schoolteacher who boarded there, and a blacksmith who'd shod Bennett's own horse the previous spring. Each of them gave what they could. None of it was much on its own. Together, added to what Jedediah himself was willing to put in from his own trail wages. Money meant for a stake in land of his own. Money he'd been saving for 3 years. It came within shouting distance of the sum owed. It still wasn't enough. Not quite. Before he'd left the Bennett place that first hour, it's worth noting why a single milk cow mattered so much in the first place, because to modern ears it might sound like a small thing to build a story around. On a frontier homestead, a dairy cow was not a luxury. It was very nearly the whole economy of a household in miniature. Milk, butter, and cheese could feed a family through seasons when the garden failed or the wheat came in thin, and surplus butter could be traded at the local store for sugar, coffee, or cloth, since cash itself was often scarce enough that entire communities ran on barter and credit at the general store's ledger. A cow that stopped producing, or a family forced to sell their only one, often meant the difference between a hard winter and a genuinely desperate one. That Sarah Bennett had been willing to sell hers at all told Jedediah, before he ever heard the word bank, exactly how little else she had left to give. He got back to the Bennett homestead a little past 1, dust-covered and breathing hard, to find Sarah standing in the yard with Grace's hand held tight in hers, both of them dressed as if for a funeral, because in every way that mattered to them, it was one. He told her what he had. She did the arithmetic in her head the way anyone does who has spent 2 years doing arithmetic on nothing but hope, and her face told him before her voice did that it wasn't going to close the gap. "It's not enough," she said quietly, "but it's more than I had an hour ago. Thank you." Truly. Jedediah looked past her, at the milk cow standing placid in its pen, chewing without any notion that its sale price was the difference between a family keeping their home and losing it. And then he looked at the herd he could see grazing on the horizon 2 miles off. His herd, for 100 head bound for the railhead, worth a fortune once delivered but worth nothing at all standing on the open range. He made a decision that any trail boss back at the outfit would have called reckless, and that Jedediah himself would later admit kept him up nights wondering if he'd done right. He rode out to his herd, cut 6 steers from the drive. Animals he had no legal right to sell without his outfit's say-so, since they belonged to the cattle company he'd contracted with, not to him personally, and drove them straight to the trading post where the storekeeper who bought and sold beef on commission for travelers passing through agreed to purchase them on the spot for cash. No questions about paperwork that would come later. It was not, strictly speaking, honest. Jedediah knew that the moment he did it, and it is worth sitting with that honestly rather than pretending a good man never makes a compromised choice under pressure. What he told himself, what he would later tell his trail boss to his face, standing there ready to take whatever consequence came, was that 6 steers, sold slightly under their market rate to raise cash fast, was a debt he intended to repay in full out of his own wages the moment the drive was delivered, and that a family's home was worth more to him in that moment than a company's ledger balancing out exactly on schedule. It was a gamble on his own character holding, on being the kind of man whose word was still good even after he'd done something his conscience wasn't entirely settled on. He rode hard past the sign marking the edge of Antelope Springs and back out along the wagon road toward the Bennett place, and made it with 11 minutes to spare before 2 o'clock. The banksman, when he arrived, a narrow, unhurried fellow named Aldridge, riding a good horse and carrying a leather satchel like it held nothing more dramatic than grocery receipts, did not so much as blink at the sight of a trail-worn cowboy standing beside the widow with a stack of coin and small bills counted out on a barrel top. Men like Aldridge had seen every kind of last-minute scramble a frontier debtor could produce, and it made no difference to him personally whether the note got paid by a widow's tears or a stranger's charity. A debt satisfied was a debt satisfied, and his job that day was arithmetic, not judgment. He counted it twice, came out $4.30 short of the full sum owed with interest. For one terrible second, nobody in that yard breathed. Then Jedediah reached into his own coat pocket, past the money he'd already given, into what remained of his own trail wages, the very last of the stake he'd spent 3 years building toward a homestead claim of his own, and counted out $4.30 onto the barrel without a word. Aldridge wrote out the receipt marking the note paid in full, tipped his hat with the same unbothered courtesy he'd have shown collecting the deed instead, and rode back toward Cheyenne as though nothing of any particular consequence had happened that afternoon at all. It would be easy to end the story there with the villain, if a man simply doing his job can even be called a villain, riding off and the widow safe in her home. But the truer, quieter part of this story happened in the weeks that followed, and it is the part that matters most. Jedediah stayed 3 more days at the Bennett place before he had to catch back up with his herd, and in those 3 days he did the work of a hired hand rather than a suitor. Mending the fence he'd first noticed sagging, patching the barn roof before autumn rains could get in, teaching Grace how to properly seat a saddle, because nobody had thought to since her father died. He asked nothing in return and offered nothing that looked like courting, because Sarah Bennett had just spent 2 years learning the hard way that a woman alone had to be careful what kind of debt she let herself owe to a man, financial or otherwise. But something had shifted regardless, the way it does between 2 people who have stood together at 2 o'clock in an afternoon that could have ended everything. When he rode out to rejoin his outfit, he told his trail boss the truth about the 6 steers before the man could even ask, and offered to work the debt off out of his own share of the drive's pay rather than have it come out of anyone else's. His trail boss, a gruff, plain-spoken man named Foss who had seen a great many things go wrong on cattle drives but not many men volunteered to confess a mistake before they were caught, docked his pay for the value of the steers, called it settled, and said nothing more about it, which on the frontier was about as close to forgiveness as a man in that line of work generally got. Jedediah wrote to Sarah Bennett once the drive was delivered at Ogallala that autumn, and she wrote back, and by the following spring he had saved enough, honestly this time, to buy a small parcel adjoining her homestead rather than filing his own claim further west as he'd originally planned. He asked her properly that summer, in her own yard, with Grace old enough by then to understand exactly what was being asked and to approve of it loudly before her mother had even finished answering. The moral of this story is not simply that kindness gets rewarded, though in this case it plainly was. It is that real character shows itself most clearly under exactly the kind of pressure that gives a person every reasonable excuse to look away. Jedediah Calloway had no obligation to that family. He had a schedule, a paycheck, and every practical reason to finish his transaction and ride on. What he chose instead, to spend his own money, call in every favor a stranger has any right to call in, and even risk his own good name on a gamble that his integrity would hold up after the fact, is the kind of choice that rarely gets written into the official record of how the West was settled, but was every bit as responsible for it. It is also worth remembering, whenever we hear a story about the frontier, that the hardship families like the Bennetts faced was rarely a single dramatic villain riding in to ruin them. It was paperwork. It was a note that came due on a fixed date regardless of what a family had endured that year. It was a legal system that gave a grieving widow far less protection than it gave a bank. The real heroism of the frontier, more often than not, was not found in outrunning outlaws or fighting off raiders, but in neighbors who understood that the difference between a family keeping their home and losing it sometimes came down to nothing more than who showed up, and what they were willing to risk in the few hours before the clock ran out. A cowboy rode out that morning to buy a cow. He rode home 3 days later having bought something he never once put a price on and never regretted for the rest of his life.